Okay, thanks for clicking play there. I am here with Professor Lloyd. Do I say Mayer or Meyer?
It's Meyer.
It is Meyer. Okay. Of the Notre Dame Law School, and you've been there for quite a bit. How many years, Professor?
This is my 17th year.
Oh my gosh. Okay. And before that, you did practice for a short time at Kaplan and Drysdale in DC?
Yeah, not that short, actually. 9 years full time.
Oh, all right. Okay. Okay. In this area, were you in the nonprofit tax
Yes.
law? Okay. Professor Meyer studies, researches, teaches, and writes about this area, nonprofit law. Some of his work on what I'll call the distinction, we can get into whether it is or isn't, between charity and politics caught our eye at the Giving Review. So we wanted to get him on and chat a little bit about that. But let's start. Well, where are you from, Professor? How does a nice guy like you end up at Notre Dame, where Lou Holtz went from Minnesota to Notre Dame, hurting me still? But how'd you end up there?
Well, basically, they offered me a job. That's how I ended up here. I grew up on the East Coast, born in Toronto, grew up in Philadelphia, worked in DC, went to college on the West Coast. But never lived in the Midwest before. But when I entered the academic market, you apply to all the law schools when you do that, and you see who's interested. And Notre Dame was interested, and it finally worked out. And quite happy to be here.
So the length of time you've been there, you are an expert on winter driving now, and you got chains on the car, tires, or your home.
I'm an expert winter driving without chains and without even special tires. You know, you can pull that off around here. I do have all-wheel drive cars.
Yeah. Now, are students at Notre Dame interested in nonprofit law in particular? Has there been a change in the level of interest in that topic among the students, or what?
No, I think there's a subset of students who are interested, and it's been pretty steady over the years. You know, I teach the nonprofit course about once every 2 years, and there's usually about 20, 25 students in the class who are interested, and some others who contact me in between offerings and want to write papers or so forth.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get realizing the total unfairness of me asking you a question at this level of generality when you teach courses about it. I assume about nuance and distinctions. I'm on the subsidy question. Is tax exemption or tax deduction, when is or isn't that to be considered either legally or conceptually by us a subsidy?
Well, there's some debate on both points, but I think fairly the tax deduction for charitable contributions is almost certainly a subsidy. That's how the Joint Committee on Taxation views it. It costs, they estimate, about $280 billion in tax revenues over 5 years that the federal government otherwise would collect. And so it does subsidize charities in the sense that they're treated differently than other entities that receive funds from whatever sources. The tax exemption itself is a little more complicated. There's good work done by Dan Hartmann, who's a retired Harvard professor, and summarized in an article for tax notes that Ellen April at Los Angeles and I wrote, that basically says, for the most part, it's not a subsidy. Even if you didn't have a special provision, most of the revenues that charities receive would not be subject to tax anyway, because they're, for example, gifts, or they're used for charitable purposes pretty quickly. The two exceptions are when they would not be able to avoid tax right away. So a business that buys a building, for example, can't deduct all that right away. They have to spread those deductions over time, so-called capital expenditure. And so charities, because they don't have to pay tax if they buy a building and wait for the deductions later, there's sort of a subsidy there. And the other big area, which has been an area of controversy, is investment income. Because charities can invest money and get all the earnings tax-free, usually, for the most part, then they're able to avoid some tax that otherwise, let's say, a business or a private individual would pay. And again, even if they get a deduction down the road, there's a savings in terms of the time value of money at that point. And this can be really significant for the largest charities in terms of investments, the large universities, including the one where I'm sitting, but also the private foundations that are out there that have a lot of money in the bank, frankly.
Has anybody ever tried to put a number like the Joint Committee does with subsidies, or with deductions. Has anyone tried to put a number that you're aware on what would be if they considered it the tax expenditure on exemption?
No one really has. Joint committee hasn't. Not much of anyone else really has for charities. It's just a hard exercise because, again, it's not about that this money should be taxed. It should be taxed now, and then maybe you get an offset deduction later. And so there's a lot of variables there. I mean, some charities save money now, but they eventually spend it in a few years, right? There's only a slight delay. Well, other places like Notre Dame, but also Harvard and private foundations may put a lot of money in the bank, which basically sits there forever.
Yeah. All right. On then now charity and politics. Two questions. Again, unfair because broad. Well, the two questions are: is charity too politicized, I'll say, as opposed to political? And then I kind of want to narrow it, is philanthropy. Meaning when I say that, I usually mean private foundations because I worked at one, but there are other givers. Is that too politicized, either in general or for purposes of the law of the 69 tax law?
So historically, charities have been involved in politics sometimes, right? Because of charities' basic characteristics, they pursue public benefit or public good. But that vision of public benefit, public good may be different than the government's vision, whatever the democratic process is putting out there. Sometimes that vision requires or at least supports getting involved in politics in the sense of trying to shape government priorities, trying to shape the priorities of an education, the public education system, for example, or so on. So there's a long history of charities, sometimes, not most, not all, being involved with politics. But there's two problems with it. And this is where the pushback comes from. One is the subsidy problem. If you give money to a candidate, if you engage in lobbying, whether it's an individual or business, you don't get to deduct that. You don't get to save taxes on that. But if I give to a charity and it doesn't, then I do, right? So that's a way around the fact that usually you don't get a tax deduction for engaging in political activity, certain kinds of political activity. And that's part of the reason the limits exist on charities engaging in politics, the formal limits in the tax code. The other issue, which is more subtle, but is also maybe more important, is should charities be a bit separate from government? There's an idea of sectors, right? The government is the government and has the power of coercion, but it's supposed to do public benefit, but it's also subject and accountable to the people, right? In lots and lots of ways, which has advantages and disadvantages. Businesses, right, are in business to make money, to drive economic growth. We want to think about them though as separate from the government. We get nervous about businesses, for example, wielding government-like powers for good reason. And charities are supposed to, again, pursue public good, public benefit, whatever the vision, but a much broader vision than what the government does, because all it takes is one person, right, to launch a charity, really, and maybe even one person to fund it. But again, should they be sort of separate from the government and not trying to use the tools of government to advance their agenda? Because this is private efforts to pursue public good, and you sort of muddy that if you start lobbying the government or getting the government involved. And I think that's where the tension tends to come in. People think charities should be outside or separate from politics. They get these subsidies, which is great, but they shouldn't be moving the government to do what they want to do. That's the whole point of them being separate.
Is this becoming a bigger issue? The politicization is there's more politics in nonprofit, isn't there, lately?
It's a bigger issue for a couple of reasons. I mean, one issue is that just the divisiveness we generally have, right? And so nonprofits, are perceived as part of that divisiveness because some of them, again, not many, not all certainly, are lined up very ideologically one way or the other. But it also builds into a larger concern about the influence of particularly wealthy individuals on society. And this is not a partisan concern, right? There are people on the left and right that are concerned about concentrations of wealth and the ability to influence society more broadly. And one tool for that is charities, right? Particularly private foundations, but also donor-advised funds and other efforts. And so if you're concerned about whether it's the Koch brothers or it's George Soros or the Gateses, and then their influence on society. One vehicle they use is charities. And so you might be concerned about charities getting involved in politics and pursuing a political agenda that you have a problem with, or just sort of using the halo of being a charity to leverage that influence.
Great. Well, now, why don't you've written, I think you've got some ideas about how to maybe address, if not solve these problems. Why don't we deal with those in a part 2 in a bit?
Sure.